Income is the name of the game. That's the 80-20 of where we need to be focusing. We need to be minimizing vacancy. We need to be achieving quality rents. Welcome to the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. I'm your host, Axel Ragnarsson, and on this show, I dissect how seasoned multifamily investors started, built, and scaled their businesses. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another quick solo episode here on the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the exciting topic of resident retention and resident retention strategies. How do we get more renewals at our multifamily property? If you are in multifamily, this should be your chief focus right now as it relates to operations and asset management. Reason being is lease tradeouts are not as appealing as they were in the last 5, 7, 10 years, however far back you want to go. When a tenant leaves nowadays, the tenant that you're placing is probably not going to be at a much higher rent, assuming that the previous tenant was placed at market rent at the time of their lease signing. Therefore, we want to disincentivize folks to leave. We want to retain as many residents as we possibly can. We want that renewal rate to be as high as it possibly can. So how do we do that? Right, I want to share kind of a few tips here, probably 3 tips, or maybe 4, depending on how I define the last one, as it relates to retaining residents. So number 1, comes down to rents. Don't push rents to market or above market upon lease expiration. And again, we are very focused with our rent roll as multifamily operatives. We're very focused with our total operating income because income is the name of the game. That's the 80-20 of where we need to be focusing. We need to be minimizing vacancy. We need to be achieving quality rents. So oftentimes on renewal, we're trying to push those rents, keep them at market where we would lease the next, or we would sign a lease with the next tenant at. But oftentimes you have to understand that maybe the market has changed since the tenant last signed a lease. Maybe it's a different season. Maybe they didn't sign a 12-month and the seasonality is different. Maybe the market is just a little bit worse than it was last year in terms of a tenant demand standpoint. I'm actually going to lease at a rent that was lower than where the current tenant signed at. And it's important to actually do an audit and not just take a flat 3%, 5%, whatever approach to renewing leases. You should actually do rent comp analysis on that specific unit at the time of offering the renewal and determine what the market rent is and what an appropriate renewal price is, which is probably going to be slightly below where the market rent is. And that makes economic sense as an operator because you're reducing vacancy and you're keeping that rent roll as close to market as you can. You're minimizing your loss to lease, but you're also reducing that turnover time that comes with trading out a lease. So let's say the market rent is $1,600 for a unit, current tenant's at $1,500. Maybe you try to get them to $1,550, $1,565, $1,570, something that's within a few percent, couple percent of the market rent. And therefore you're creating a win-win for yourself and the resident. They're staying at slightly below market pricing, but you are reducing vacancy as well. So tip number 2, start the renewal process sooner than you think you have to. Instead of it being 30 or 60 days out of lease expiration, where you start discussing renewal with a prospective resident, start at 90 days out, 100 days out. You want to start that process as soon as you possibly can, within reason. Obviously, a tenant's probably not going to sign a renewal 6 months into their lease unless they proactively bring it up. But it's important that you actually have that conversation before the tenant starts thinking about alternative living solutions or where alternative apartments that they might move to. So you want to have that conversation well before the lease expires. And the little pro tip above and beyond that is before you even bring up the renewal conversation, you should try to do something that elicits some goodwill. Ask them if there's any outstanding maintenance requests that they have. Ask them how it's going at the apartment. How has your experience been living here? Is anything broken? If you were to improve something, what would you improve? And sometimes you're going to get a piece of feedback that's pretty marginal, right? Oh, my toilet kind of runs or my sink is a little leaky. So you come in there, you take care of it, you do a good job on the maintenance side. And then when you offer the renewal or you start to have that discussion, you've created some goodwill and there's a bit of a warmer feeling around the apartment and the living situation on the resident side. And again, this is not going to be scalable across a massive portfolio, but if you have a resident who, let's say, is like, the lighting in my living room is terrible, right? And maybe you didn't change the light fixtures when you did the turn and it's like a marginal lift. Maybe you go in there and actually do a little bit of an upgrade And it actually makes sense to do so because you're going to have to do it anyways if you turn the unit. But now you've actually retained the resident as well and minimized vacancy. Strategy number 3 here is to just offer longer leases at the lease up, at the point of initial lease up. So something that we've been doing when we're leasing up units in off-peak seasons, which would be late fall throughout the winter and then early spring, at least in our market in New England and specifically New Hampshire, is we offer a 12-month lease option, a 9-month lease option, or an 18-month lease option, right? And we really push people to sign the 18-month option at a slightly lower rate than the 12-month, because now we obviously have that unit spoken for a longer period of time and we're reducing vacancy, but we're also bringing that unit into a more prime leasing season, which then allows us, if we do have to turn that unit over, we're achieving a better rent. And we'd rather have most of our turnover coming in the prime season versus spread throughout the year so that we would consistently achieve the best rents. Now, lastly, you want to have very specific relationships with residents. And this is going to be tip number 4. And this is going to be hard to do when you have a third-party management company because you're deferring to their processes. You can't necessarily get in their business and change how they do things. But anything you can do to create a more personalized process around the renewal process is helpful. And that's going to be tenant specific, right? And what I'm talking about is building great relationships throughout the year, sending them a happy birthday message on their birthday, trying to determine a sense of who's actually living in the apartment and speaking to them on a more personal level so that you create that goodwill between resident management company. That's going to be important. Doing anything upon the lease expiration or when you're getting closer to lease expiration that makes their life a little bit easier and gets outside of your standard process. So for example, let's say you have a resident who their lease is coming up June 1st or May 31st, right? End of May. And they're like, we're thinking about moving, but we're not totally sure if we're going to move. We're probably not going to know until like June, 15th or July 1st. If I get this new job and this town over, what have you, we can't really commit to a renewal. But if we have to, we're probably going to end up moving. So in this situation, right, maybe you allow them to convert to a month-to-month tenant for another 30 days at a price that is not your month-to-month, bump rate where you have your base rent plus a month-to-month bump. But you give them another 30 days, you kind of work with them on a one-to-one basis, you try to incentivize them to stay, and you actually get outside of your normal process to have that dialogue. And typically, renewals occur because there's a handful of different things happening at the property. You're taking care of maintenance quickly, you're getting into the renewal process sooner than later, you're creating that great relationship with the resident or as best as you can throughout the time that they're living in the apartment. And then you get outside of your core process a little bit where it makes sense to do so. And oftentimes that creates a lot of goodwill. That creates a great living experience for the person living in the apartment. And then they're a little bit more open to actually signing a renewal and leaning to that side of the table versus the other side, which is moving and making a more drastic decision. So I shared 4 tips there and I hope they were helpful. But in general, this should be something you're thinking about on a recurring basis. You should be constantly trying to renew folks and minimize your vacancy, minimize your turnover, because as rent growth slows, resident retention remains or it becomes more important than ever, I should say. It's always important, but it becomes even more important. So if you took something tactical away from this episode that you think you can apply in your own business, please consider leaving the podcast a rating and review, as it helps the show get noticed by more folks. But again, thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode.